Great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for staying on till the end. I promise drinks are coming soon, VIP drinks nonetheless as well. But we're here to discuss the emerging but undeniably important topic of biodiversity. PwC actually estimates that half of the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. I would argue that that's 100%, but we're going to discuss that today, and we've got a really stellar panel to discuss that, which has just been introduced. So it's perhaps taking a little bit of a step back, and I wonder whether, Michael, I'll turn to you first. Could you explain, as an investor, how you view biodiversity from a risk management perspective, from an impact perspective, from even an investment opportunity perspective, and ultimately, why should asset owners care about biodiversity?
Absolutely, thanks for the question. I would say that investors view this as a non-diversifiable systemic risk. And asset owners that depend on economic growth to fund pension liabilities should care about it because it has a potential to disrupt their ability to fulfill their purpose over many decades. And it's a sort of easy problem statement to utter, but a really difficult problem to start to begin with for a number of reasons. I think that there's a lot of competition for governance budget across financial institutions. And that governance budget gets consumed by stewardship and ESG, and that's very sensible. And it gets consumed by climate change, and that's very sensible. Now, there's another topic. And for pension funds, insurers, there's so much going on already in the UK with funding, investment strategy, sustainability of the employer, and to add another topic and to try and bring along senior stakeholders in workshops and with board reports takes a very long time. So there's a real challenge with knowing where to begin. Andy just made a point about data in the climate world of saying, well, we've got enough data to sort of crack on. Data in the biodiversity world is a different level of problem. There's also an extent to which, because biodiversity and climate are often sort of laid side by side and people explore the interconnectivities between them, there's also an extent to which climate benefits from some relative simplicity in that people can get behind something like the Paris Agreement and have some sort of consistency of measure and metric with 1.5 degrees net zero, that kind of thing. But with biodiversity, nature-related issues, we have so many metrics, quite rightly, but that just adds to the complexity of knowing where to begin. So plenty of challenges in trying to think, how do we make some observation about the extent to which we're exposed to this risk? Plenty of challenges with trying to understand, well, what on earth can we possibly do about it? We're starting to talk to our portfolio companies. We have an established program of climate-related engagements. Railpen, by the way, manages money directly, and most of our equities are in-house. So we have a program of engaging companies on climate change, and there's a big intersection between climate change and biodiversity with regards to the economic sectors that matter. So we started lacing in biodiversity questions into our engagements, trying to understand what are your plans, what's your level of ambition. Companies, by the way, actually face quite a lot of resourcing challenges themselves because their attentions are diverted to other sustainability challenges, which are also really important. And we're trying to add to our information set bottom up. But I think there's an extent to which the industry is waiting for consensus, and there's a lot of wait and see going on. So in summary, I think investors see this as a big systemic risk because it could impact economic growth. Pension liabilities depend on it, but getting started and actually doing something about it is a real challenge. And just engaging your corporates is not, it may or may not be a sufficient condition for dealing with this. It's definitely not it may or may not be a necessary condition for dealing with this. It's definitely not a sufficient condition for dealing with biodiversity as a risk.
And you speak about sort of biodiversity coming after climate, has done a few years after climate. Is it too much too soon? Is there some fatigue creeping in with having to deal with another aspect, or do you think that there's actually some learnings that can be made from our climate investment experience so far? I wonder whether Michael or David, you can comment on that.
Well, I think there's a lot we can learn from climate. But one of the things is data. Clearly, we need data, but I agree with what Andy said, that you can't wait till the data is perfect. You've got to start straight away and do something, because what you probably will be doing better than you're doing at the moment. I think the other thing we've learned from climate is sectors as well. You should compare across sectors. So you shouldn't really compare a supermarket with a steel company. You should compare a supermarket with a supermarket, or a tech company with a tech company. That's something that we've learned from climate. And the other thing is, as we continue to learn, we should not be stuck with what we've been doing in the past, not criticize people for what they've done in the past, encourage activity, encourage movement, and have much more of that rather than whataboutery. It's no good saying to a company that sticks their head above their parapet, well, you might have done that, but what about, are you still eating avocados? How can you possibly do that if you're talking about being, and what's that almond there? That's terrible. And so that doesn't really help. So I think you should be much more positive about what people's positive actions are, proactive behavior is, and behave that way rather than just calling people out for the little bits and things that they don't quite get right.
Mm. And, you know, despite the recent awareness and the recent sort of attention that's given to biodiversity, only a third actually of UK pension funds are invested in any natural capital. I'm going to actually just turn back to you, Michael, quickly on that. Why do you think that might be at this moment in time?
There's mine fell off. Somebody was scratching. I don't know who it was. It must have been me.
Why is only a third of pension funds invested in natural capital assets? Well, I'm surprised that it's as many as 1/3 at this point. But I would suspect that the challenges and barriers are some familiar friends. So it's a relatively new topic. Skills and experience are probably limited. Institutions have competition for capital, and if you're talking about asset owners, and on the DB side, we've had some changes in our funding levels quite recently, and so demand for illiquid products and to some extent speculative products is less than what it might have been otherwise, and a lot of the opportunities in natural capital are illiquid and early stage. There are the usual size problems, so a large institutional investor may not get economies of scale with regards to the cost of due diligence for what ends up being a small ticket size. And you may end up saying, well, okay, I want a meaningful allocation at the end of all this due diligence that I paid for, but then you end up being a pretty large investor in a pretty small fund, which comes with its own risks. I would say some of the opportunities are simply not interesting enough, and there's competition for capital. Some of the upside in the opportunities rests on credit markets, and you need to take a view on those. And I think there's not consensus with regards to where does this sit in an asset allocation? Does this sit as a standalone bucket somewhere? Is it a carve out within an existing risk bucket in some particular asset class? How would you proxy for the types of risk characteristics that such an investment carries, and how do you put that into your risk model in a sufficient way? So I think that ultimately the industry is not that mature, and so I'm surprised it's as many as a third of UK pension funds, and those I would say are the main challenges why it's not more than that.
I mean, you raised a good point on immaturity, and one of the aspects of that is data. And Sarah, just given your role in your engagements with companies, how much of a challenge is that? And will new frameworks such as the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures framework that's recently issued its guidance resolve that issue?
So it will certainly be a big help. I think just 2 comments generally on TNFD before we kind of dive into the data point is it's a much broader framework than just the metrics and targets pillar. And I do think people do get quite hung up on this kind of question of, well, we can't measure it, therefore we can't take any action yet. But actually the broader TNFD framework, there are 3 very clear pillars on governance, strategy, risk management, which are really important to pay attention to, because what you really want is companies having at the heart of board conversations, a conversation about how dependent is their business model on nature and how impactful is their business model on nature. How will their business model respond to deterioration in nature? We're seeing nature decline at accelerating and very drastic rates. That quote you made earlier, over 50% of the world's GDP is highly dependent on nature. So we know this is a systemic risk that boards really need to kind of grapple with from a strategy and risk management perspective as well. Having said that, data and targets is really important as well. And at the moment, it's very opaque. And one of the main reasons it's so opaque is because we don't have much asset-specific location data from companies. Companies are very kind of reluctant to share with the outside world kind of the precise location of their asset base. For some sectors, such as mining, it's quite hard to deny there's a mining site when you zoom out on geolocation data. But for a lot of other sectors, it's actually very hard to pinpoint. And that's not taken into account the supply chain challenges as well. We've got very large, complex global supply chains. So there's a lot of retailers out there who can't really put a finger on the sourcing country for a number of their products, let alone the kind of precise kind of farm or point of production. Now, that means that you can't interface that with ecosystems at risk or ecosystems of high water scarcity or high conservation and value. And that's the step that's really needed to start to actually build up a better view of which companies are going to be at risk from nature loss and from the transition risk that we think about in terms of increasing regulation. A really good example of that is the EU's deforestation due diligence regulation, which is going to require companies who are selling products into EU markets to be able to verify that those products are deforestation free by providing a precise timestamp and geolocation of production. And if they can't do that, they could face up to 4% of annual turnover in the EU market by way of fines and restricted access to that market. So that actually presents a very material investment risk for companies who are trading forest risk commodities, who they rely on for their products, and that could be anything from food connected with palm oil or leather goods connected with beef, or even timber products as well. So TNFD will really actually help to unlock a lot of that because it's got this real emphasis on location-specific data using the LEAP assessment framework as well. And I think the other thing we need to think about with TNFD is there is a huge kind of number of metrics that are being proposed in the final publication. That will be very overwhelming for a lot of companies and also for a lot of investors as well. We already have fairly robust data from companies on some of the pollution metrics. There's actually quite high coverage, and that's because a lot of companies are working to kind of, quite high levels of regulation around pollution metrics anyway. But there's some big gaps in terms of how do you actually assess the overarching state of nature in terms of species abundance. There's also big gaps in terms of invasive species as well. So we hope the TNFD framework will really help to accelerate that and to start to unlock some of this. But I think we can't just rely on that alone, and we can't just wait until we've got that perfect data before we start to act. There's got to be a real emphasis on those board level discussions and governance and strategy as well.
You raise a really good point on just how all-encompassing biodiversity can be across many different sectors. How do you approach companies, particularly smaller companies, about that? And what are your sort of engagement priorities when you're speaking to those companies?
So it really varies from sector to sector, as you would expect. Like a big focus for us at the moment is deforestation, and that's for a few reasons. One is we know that deforestation and ending it is going to be really critical to reaching a net zero transition pathway. We also know that forests host around 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity. So ending deforestation is a really good proxy, at least in the terrestrial space, as opposed to the marine space, for trying to reverse under some of the underlying trends of biodiversity loss as well. So a big focus for us has been on deforestation. And a lot of that work has been actually around talking to companies and trying to understand, do you have traceability across your supply chains? It comes down to quite a boring kind of traceability kind of question. Are you able to kind of work with your suppliers to understand how they in turn are working with small scale farmers to upskill them, to support them through financial incentives to reduce kind of incidences of land conversion, as well. Another big focus for us is actually that governance piece. So really ensuring that the company is starting to take this very seriously. They're on the journey to think about the LEAP assessment framework for TNFD, and it's making its way into board discussions as well. And one of the pieces of advice we have for companies who are kind of saying, well, we've just got our head around TCFD, how on earth do you expect us to do with TNFD now, is actually to leverage their existing governance framework around climate change. We hope biodiversity can be a fast follower because it's a lot of the same underlying drivers. And indeed, climate change is the top 2 out of 5 drivers of biodiversity loss. So companies should be assessing these issues at the same time and trying to integrate them into their existing governance frameworks.
And thank you. And keeping on the same track as TNFD, Mark, do you see from your position it moving in the same way as TCFD in terms of being a voluntary to mandatory process for them?
So simple answer, yes. I think we saw the direction of travel set, what was it, in 2021 with the Green Finance Strategy, the subsequent, well, which introduced the idea of a sustainable disclosures requirement. We've seen that reiterated in the 2023 revision, which talks about integrated, building on TCFD, bringing in the UK green taxonomy, looking at transition plans and bringing in TNFD. So yes, I do. I see it through that lens of ultimately an SDR, which hopefully is a streamlined regime that doesn't duplicate effort, because I know there'll be a number of people in the audience here and online who'll be thinking about the burden. If you're just doing TCFD now 2 years in, you're talking about TNFD. Is that just going to be another report requirement as opposed to an integrated part of a wider regime? So yes, I see it coming in on a voluntary basis. We're seeing that in Europe, we're seeing it elsewhere, and then going to, you know, a regulatory footing. I think is it India and Brazil and other countries are either committed to or they're looking at bringing nature-related disclosures in. So yes, long way around to getting back to saying yes.
I mean, do we all agree that TCFD has led to decision useful information?
I'm going to say as a regulator, yes. Yeah.
I think it depends what institutions were doing pre-TCFD. So I think pre-mandatory TCFD, so a lot of institutions were already using climate scenario analysis. A lot of institutions were already looking at financed emissions, and TCFD, you know, makes that mandatory, adds in some statutory guidance for UK pension funds anyway, and makes it mandatory for other people. So yeah, it really depends from institution to institution.
Very good. And moving on to sort of how biodiversity can be an investment opportunity, it's still very nascent and early stages, but there is a 700 billion financing gap in biodiversity to fill. Although that said, that's about as much as we spend on cigarettes per year, by the way, globally. But what do we think is going to accelerate investment into biodiversity? David, perhaps one.
So scale, first of all, and that's an easy thing to say, and it's difficult to build scale with something like that. But I think also for everybody to understand the part they have to play in the ecosystem, as it were. Because if you think 10 years ago, every small business that wanted a £1 million loan or £500,000 loan would go to the bank would lend them money, and etc. But now those companies can't go to the banks because the banks don't really want to lend small amounts of money. So they think, well, they can't go to the international markets because they don't want a £500,000 loan. But now they're packaged together into small, medium-term, small loans that they would have, and you can go along and you can get a fund that will invest in 1,000 loans, and that will be a way of aggregating that. So I'm sure there's ways in which there'll be aggregation. And the other thing is of course, if you're going to invest directly in biodiversity, you're probably going to need returns. But it should be differentiated between investing directly in a biodiversity fund, which will give you benefits because it'll give you diversification, because it'll mean that you can perhaps benefit from getting biodiversity net gain credits and selling them on to reputable builders or something of that nature. So it is possible to invest at the moment but it's not at scale. But of course, you can look at embedding this into your every single investment decision, just like we do now with climate. We should also do with biodiversity, and that's happening. And as that happens, that will mean that people will become more familiar with it. But of course, it's going to need education, and education amongst asset owners and asset managers and consultants, and then they can all see which part they can play in that. And developers, and developers have got to go along and develop sites, etc. So there's got to be a way to get the money from where it is at the moment, which is with the asset owners, to the people that need it. And everybody's got a part to play in that ecosystem, whether it's consultants, whether it's asset managers, whether it's regulators, lawyers, etc. And understanding that, you end up getting the money from where it is to where it's needed.
It's an interesting point. I mean, often biodiversity is viewed through the lens of impact investing, which relates to concessional maybe returns as opposed to market rate returns. But you're sort of seeing that that's possible through scale.
Well, you're right. It is. It's either impact investing where impact comes first, and of course then you hope to get a return as well. But the impact is first. But if you're including biodiversity in what you do and you want to get some sort of return, you are obliged to get a return. And of course, our journey to net zero and our journey to putting back or stopping the biodiversity loss that we've seen over the last 50 years that we're responsible for isn't going to be cheap, but it's a lot cheaper than the alternative, which is doing nothing about it. So it's rather like, I think it was the chap that runs EasyJet said, well, if you think education is expensive, you should try ignorance. And I think it's similar to that.
One of the benefits that climate has is this sort of overarching North Star concept of net zero. Is it foolish to try to do that with biodiversity? Does it need that kind of globally recognized framework in order to spur that investment?
I mean, in some ways we do have that North Star. It's just not one point. It's more of a North Universe or whatever you want to call it, through the Global Biodiversity Framework, which actually sets out very clear expectations for where we need to get to by 2030, and then where we consequently need to get to by 2050. And sitting within that framework, there are 23 targets for 2030, which include things like halving food waste by 2030, halving excess production of nutrients, so thinking about excess fertilizer, excess pesticides by 2030 as well, and then also conserving 30% of land, inland waters and marine ecosystems by 2030 as well. So that's a plethora of goals. And then the challenge then becomes for companies to think about, well, where are they aligned with those goals, and how can they contribute to them as well?
Fantastic. And Mark, what do you think the regulator is going to be looking at as we start increasing awareness and investment into biodiversity?
I think it's very much where we are currently. So we look at things through the lens of risk management and the outcomes for savers. So it's about protecting and enhancing those outcomes for savers. So identifying, managing, and mitigating risks, looking at opportunities for investment and exploiting those. So it'll very much be through that lens. So it'll focus on good stewardship and governance, what the risk management processes are, how those risks are being considered and factored into those investment decisions, the development and raising of standards, the adoption of good practice is very much where we'll focus. And I think also some of the lessons from climate that have been touched on by earlier panels is the role of a qualitative approach to risk management and the use of narratives, particularly where we don't have the data. I personally feel we're going to start this journey very much having to get used to that absence of data, and how do we deal with that? And also what's been touched on as well about metrics. They're going to be complex, they're going to evolve. How do we deal with that? They won't necessarily lend themselves to a simple portfolio dashboard. So all of that we're going to have to deal with. And I see narratives and that qualitative approach having a key role moving forward.
Is there a worry that this becomes the next sort of greenwashing battleground?
Potentially. Very much so. And that is going to be the challenge for all of us.
I think there's also a risk it becomes the next boilerplate exercise.
Yes.
And I think what Mark has just said is really, really sensible. It's about what you do so that you act in line with your beneficiary's interest. And I think there's a real skill to getting the disclosure regulations right, so that people don't simply regress to the lowest common denominator and put out something meaningless and treat it like a reporting exercise. The reporting is an outcome of a process of good governance and good risk management.
Yes. I'd emphasize from my perspective, it's not a tick box exercise from either a preparer's point of view or a regulator's compliance review. It's about, very much as being said, it's the output of actions and decisions that have been taken and the use of useful information and data.
Yes, we have covered today the cost of the burden of compliance and disclosure. Perhaps this is a question just for everyone. What's the real cost of inaction actually on this issue for corporates and investors?
Well, it's huge.
Yeah.
We know that 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries have already been crossed, and those boundaries developed by the Stockholm Resilience Centre really outline the point at which nature can no longer regenerate and self-regulate. And if it can't do that, that means it's going to no longer be able to produce those ecosystem services that we rely on in the economy. So that's carbon sequestration, it's water purification, it's the air we breathe. So, that's really fundamental to all the products and goods we produce in the economy. So if we don't start acting quite urgently to reverse those trends, then the economic cost is potentially huge, not least because this point around data availability means that we're not currently pricing those externalities into financial markets, which means we don't really have a sense currently of what those individual risks mean to companies, which could result in mispricing, which can result in a wider range of financial stability risks as well. So I think that hopefully kind of paints the scene for kind of acting urgency, and actually, the cost could be much bigger if we don't act.
I mean, it is huge, and we've had 5 great extinctions in the past, between 400 billion years ago and 66 billion years ago. The last one, the most famous one, the dinosaurs, and we're now at the 6th extinction, and that's when you see between 75 and 85% of all species becoming extinct. And the 6th extinction, which most scientists think we're at now, is down to us, which is quite incredible when you think about it. And of course, every time the Earth regenerates and all the rest, and something else takes its place. So everything that's alive now, pretty much, is alive because something else became extinct and took that thing's place. The thing is that probably the species that won't be around will be humans. So if we're not careful, so it's critically important.
I'd add to that, without addressing nature and biodiversity loss, you're not going to hit net zero, because climate and biodiversity and ecosystem services are so intertwined. So yes, it's fundamental.
And if you're a company, medium-sized company, and you do have this burden of other disclosures, is there a financial implication and cost as well to not sort of advancing on this as quickly as you possibly can?
I mean, just take one example, Gap, a clothing producer, most people are familiar with, 70% around of its fiber sourcing is cotton. And last year in 2022, around 40% of Pakistan's cotton output was destroyed from flooding, which you can argue is being driven by climate change and nature loss, which has significant ramifications for a company whose entire business model is predicated on those kind of outputs from nature. So I think this isn't just a medium-term risk that we're thinking about. This is impacting kind of companies today, and means that companies who haven't really sorted out their supply chains, who haven't worked with their suppliers and those small-scale farmers to build resilience in their supply chains, are going to be facing increasing cost pressures. And then if you add to that regulatory pressures and I guess kind of rights to operate from community members as well, then it paints up a pretty urgent picture for companies to get their heads around.
Yeah, and there's no question, Sarah's right. You want to buy companies that source their products from a sustainable source rather than one that doesn't. just makes obvious sense.
I think we've got some time for some audience questions if we have them. Oh, there we go. Up front. We do also have Slido, I believe, working. Is that right? No.
Really, just building on what David's just said just now, probably the single biggest sector that has a responsibility here is the farming and land management sector. Having just finished 3 years as chairman of Scottish Land and Estates, I've spent the last 3 years grappling with this thing. And one of the biggest barriers we have come across in terms of being able to get, in essence, farmers to be able to measure what they do so that supermarkets can then say, I'm buying from a sustainable source or I'm not, is actually the whole question of measurement. So, for example, cows emit methane, and methane is deadly because for 20 years, although it doesn't stay longer than 20 years, it has a carbon equivalent which is quite high. On the other hand, if cows graze new pasture, they actually sequester more carbon than trees. The important thing is that they've got to be on new pasture. And the question is the quality of the pasture. And it's done by mob grazing. So you move the cows around the field after a period. So they're always treading on new grass. But the big question is, how on earth do you measure that? And you're all talking about financing, or how do you finance biodiversity? The single biggest thing the industry could do is to find a way of financing some of the incredible research that's going on in this in many of our universities, most notably Napier and Edinburgh. And I just wonder how we can get money channeled so that we can do this, so that farmers can provide a really auditable biodiversity and carbon report.
I can kick that one off. Yeah, you're completely right. Our food industry is the leading driver of biodiversity loss. That's one of the reasons why in the Global Biodiversity Framework, there are actually very clear expectations on the agricultural industry in a very short time scale to 2030. And the challenge is huge. So agriculture will need to feed a growing population in less land because more land is being allocated for conservation, more land is being allocated for population, and more land is being allocated for energy security as well. But they're going to need to do that while increasing their yield, while reducing the inputs in terms of fertilizer and pesticide, and while reducing land conversion of old forest ecosystems, for example, peatlands, wetlands, grasslands as well. So that's a huge challenge, but it's also, there's quite a lot of exciting opportunities if you think about that. And there are a number of companies out there who are kind of drawing on academic research and evidence, really starting to innovate, looking at various solutions from precision agriculture to feed additives. We're also starting to see a lot of companies higher up the value chain making commitments, and we haven't seen how these commitments play out in practice at this stage, but to actually really scale up their approaches to regenerative agriculture. For the last few years, we've seen a lot of experimentation. We've seen the kind of Nestle's of this world saying, well, we've put this fund over here and we're really pleased with progress on this farm, but it doesn't really scale in comparison to their global footprint. But we are now starting to see these companies commit to sourcing 50% of their produce from regenerative agriculture by 2030. So there's definitely ambition there. So I think you're completely right. There's a piece there around kind of allocating capital to the companies who are innovating, who are going to support that transition across the agricultural value chain. But there's also kind of wider responsibility on actors up the value chain to be kind of working with those innovators to actually start to reorient their business model as well. But the challenge is a tough one.
Yeah, Stéphane Pouillin from the Digital Economist. I have maybe a simple observation, something I always bothered me. I'm French, as you can see with my accent. So when I'm traveling on the other side of the world and I see a French bottle of wine, although I'm French, I don't understand why this bottle of wine is there. And the reverse is exactly the same. When I am in France or here in the UK and I see a bottle of wine coming from the other side of the world, talking about this very fast acceleration of species deterioration, that makes me completely mad. And it's just an example, of course. I could have picked up any forms of other vegetables or things like that we are flowing every single day from one place to another. I was in Dubai. There is almost nothing that is created locally. I don't really know if we need much of research where we just probably need to produce locally and to, de-globalize to re-globalize or whatever we want to call it, so that we have developed this mindset of perfect tomatoes or perfect apples, and everything that is growing in our own little backyard is not good enough. And at the end of the day, simplicity, common sense will save us. I mean, we were talking about the last pieces. Maybe we won't be there, and maybe some others will be. But I would like to have the panel opinion on why we are losing common sense here. Just this.
Yeah, Stefan, I think that's a very good point. As long as it doesn't stretch to making us drink English wine instead of French wine, I'd agree with you. And I think we should think about having much more local produce, and as much as we can grow at home, and understanding that. And I do think people are getting cognizant of the air miles that the Kenya beans have traveled when they're eating them, and the strawberries that they're eating in February. They think, maybe I don't have those anymore. So I think that we are getting better at that. Maybe we're not at peak air mile at the moment, but I think we're probably certainly appreciative of it as a society. And I think the supermarkets will become more conscious of it. And we're trying to eat healthily, but that doesn't mean eating fruit and vegetables from around the world all the time. So I think we'll get there, but it is something else that's we should not beat ourselves too much up about it, but just try to think of ourselves, what's our target, and get there. But I agree with you.
I could maybe add, I think what you're pointing out is that there's a big problem with consumption habits. And the point that the gentleman made in the front is a really well made point as well. And taken together, this just says to me that this is a systems level challenge that requires a systems level solution, but it goes way beyond just what financial institutions are capable of doing themselves. And in fact, we have not that much influence over the consumer, but when the consumer is in front of the supermarket aisle and choosing which beef to buy, and hopefully making a consumption choice based on reliable data for the positive and the negative consequences of how that product was consumed, it needs ultimately to be in the best interests of the consumer to make the right choice. And at the moment, too often, the consumer is penalized for making the sustainable choice. So there needs to be a big invisible hand element to solving these problems. And financial institutions are part of the solution. We're here ready to play ball, but not the only part. This is a big systemic challenge. I think too often we go straight to the listed companies in our portfolios to say, can we have a chat about this topic? And the problem's way bigger than that.
It is. If I could just go back to the gentleman's question here about the money going to the research in the very good research centres in Edinburgh and Napier. I think that's the sort of thing that some of the supermarkets might think about doing, because they're the ones that would benefit from that, rather than just taking money from investors to then go and put into research, because you're not getting a direct return, whereas the supermarkets would probably get a direct return because they get an increase in their sales from understanding that these things have come from the right places, as it were. So it sounds like a bit of a fudge by saying, well, you ask somebody else for the money, but they're the ones that would be the ones that benefit financially, I think.
Just to add very quickly on that, we are seeing other trends around onshoring of supply chains, which are being driven by a range of set factors outside of this space, from geopolitical concerns, trying to clean up supply chains for human rights reasons as well. But we can't, as you say, just rely on that happening organically. There is a kind of systems change here point as well, as Michael was saying, in terms of governments and industry working together to come up with solutions. But I think also in this point about the consumer is really important because the food industry also needs to deliver healthy and nutritious food for the consumer. It needs to tackle food poverty. And it also needs to start thinking about climate-friendly diets as well. So there's a huge kind of nexus of different issues that are at play here, which requires a lot of systems thinking and a lot of collaboration between different actors working together to solve.
Absolutely.
I think we have one question at the back and then one down the front.
Hi, Joseph Naim of Commons Capital. It makes a lot of sense for TNFD to use the rails of TCFD for reporting purposes, but when it comes to dual materiality, which is quite different in TNFD, surely the transmission mechanisms and the massive complexity of biodiversity require different asset classes to be mobilized. And in that respect, what evidence do you see of mobilizing credit default swaps or the insurance markets, where it responsibilizes sovereign debt and insurance on potential biodiversity loss, where the local issuers are more responsible on how they go about doing it, rather than being so prescriptive in a very imperfect way from an equity or commodity perspective, when looking at what locally supermarkets or equities that we're buying could be done. Surely that should be the area that we should place more emphasis in innovation.
Who wants to take that one? Maybe, can I give it to you, Michael? Sorry if that's a hospital pass.
Well, I don't really have a view, and Dr. Miles said earlier that it's metacognitive sophistication to admit that you don't know something. So on that basis, I don't have a view, I'm afraid.
I can take a quick stab. It won't be a perfect answer by any means. I think we have started to see a number of the Latin American countries who are issuing sustainable bonds, very much framing their sustainable bonds around their nature-based economy. And they are starting to work with a number of the kind of international development banks who are kind of playing a role in underwriting risk. For some of the kind of sovereign issuances around sustainable bonds. And, I think examples of that recently are kind of Ecuador, likely to see kind of movements as well from Brazil, who have been doing a lot of work under their new administration to develop their own sustainable finance kind of taxonomy and thinking about that from an issuing perspective as well. So I do think it's starting to happen. I also think there's a big scope for that in terms of the 30% conservation targets by 2030. In order to do that well, you can't just draw a line on a map and say, oh, this is conserved, we can leave that now. A lot of funding actually needs to go into protection of those spaces, but also field scientists to actually observe and monitor the benefits that that's bringing to communities as well. So I think that's another avenue for kind of more of the credit-based insurance markets to be supporting with allocation of funding.
We did have one more question. Yeah, sure.
You passed the buck on funding research at Napier just now. Do you look at the way that supermarkets and other investees fund research, both for these fundamental things that might relate to nature, but then more generally for their own innovation, and indeed look further at how they support their supply chain members? You've talked about supply chains and small companies and difficulty getting them funded, but just simply getting big companies to pay them faster sometimes could make a massive difference.
It makes a massive difference. Yeah. No, you're right. Particularly when they're paying small companies, you want to make sure that they pay them within 30 days as a limit. Those things make a big difference. And when we're talking to the asset managers, and the asset managers then talk to the companies for us, it wants to be detailed like that. And there were some companies, a chocolate company, for example, that we own, was looking at how they display their chocolates, and the plastic that's got to go above there is compostable, which is fantastic. All the efforts done by the owner himself of the chocolate company. So I think that those things do make a big difference, and making sure that they buy their cocoa from responsible sources, and making sure that they do all the right things there. So I think the answer to that question is yes, it is important.
Just to add to that, what we're seeing, particularly when we look at deforestation regulation, is we're starting to see larger players up the value chain offering financial incentives for certified products, working with small scale farmers, even instances of them saying, we know you want to clear this piece of land, but we'll pay you not to. So there's quite a lot of work going on there, but there is quite a big bifurcation depending on who their clients are of those kind of smaller scale kind of producers and processors of commodities. So companies who are serving regional markets in Asia who don't have the same kind of regulatory pull from EU markets, and their primary client base is Asia based, don't have that financial incentive. Whereas you typically have those companies who are servicing an EU client base, who are seeing these regulations come through, are starting to move, and you're starting to see a price premium for commodities which are certified as well. I think the question becomes, as we actually approach 2025, which is the biting point for this piece of regulation, like what happens to that price premium if a company is having to service all of their produce to meet those same standards? Will they be able to continue to charge a differential? It's not clear.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think we're at time there. So just want to give a big round of applause to the panelists for such an engaging discussion.